This is Jason Reed Pratt, author of Cry of Justice. Have you been cringing in anticipation of me inflicting upon the internet an hour-long version of my 7-ish minute introduction to Mark Herman and Volke Runke's board game Fire in the Lake, published by GMT Games, which I already warned last episode was coming and which would be pointlessly over-designed and unnecessary? Me too! Fortunately, I lapsed into sanity long enough to realize that I could just skip all that material now and move along to a focus on the 4 main factions instead. What does it mean to play the U.S.? The U.S. forces, except bases, have by far the most favorable combat rules. Not surprisingly. This includes the unique combat attrition ability of removing an enemy piece for every U.S. piece removed. It's literally suicide for anyone on Team North to fight the U.S. directly. Only your specs, which the game calls irregulars, don't get this ability. The U.S. starts with the most victory points at 38 and needs at least 51 to win the game. The U.S. scores victory points by troops being home. They also score by Saigon being supported in South Vietnam areas, but having troops at home is a unique U.S. scoring factor. The U.S. has the 3rd most numerous forces in the game with 40 troops, thus the cubes, 6 specs, and 6 bases. But they start with the fewest troops on the board in a full game. They and Arvin can have forces sent completely out of play, but the U.S. alone can have casualties, reflecting their advanced hospital systems. Casualties delay forces being sent out of play and usually redirect 2/3 of them back to being available instead. The U.S. is the only faction which never spends resources on their abilities. In effect, they have bottomless resources, so there's no point for them to track the cost and expenditure. They can often take command of Arvin forces, though. This requires spending Arvin resources, down to the limit of Arvin's econ strength, which represents the line between money earned by Arvin itself and money received from the U.S. as aid. But the Arvin player usually gets most of his money in aid from the U.S. anyway. The U.S. has the most permanent and temporary bonuses in the game by far, but each of those bonuses has an evil dark side, which can be inflicted on the U.S. by their enemies, including by the Arvin player. So the U.S. also has the most hurtful penalties in the game by far. Primarily to score, the U.S. uses pacification operations to increase support for the Saigon regime, and also sends troops and bases home to the available box during the scoring round. In a roundabout way, they can also score by losing fights, since that sends a majority of lost troops home eventually. For balancing purposes, the U.S. can only do this after the victory check at the start of the scoring round, and after the check for whether this is the final scoring round. There are also some events the U.S. can play to accomplish similar scoring setups. This includes taking forces from out of play to available, basically building up new divisions back home, which increases their score. The U.S. helps their Arvin teammate by doing military things to achieve coin, in other words, Team South, control in provinces and cities. This typically involves doing combat and strategic maneuvers. It also often involves bringing U.S. troops out of available and so lowering the U.S.'s score. On the other hand, the U.S. can screw over the Arvin by evacuating areas and by fighting Arvin patronage. The Arvin has a game mechanic where they convert U.S. aid and popular support to patronage. They win by becoming more politically corrupt and less dependent on the U.S. Like all 4 factions, the U.S. player gets a special event card called Pivotal Events that only he can throw. I won't go into detail about these cards in this quick overview, but they're unique to each player, so here it is. Last and quite literally least, the U.S. has the special ability to lose every tie it's involved in. Now, what does it mean to play the NVA? The NVA forces are the most numerous in the game. Arvin has more divisions, but not more military divisions. The NVA make up your relative lack in cubes compared to Arvin, with lots of bases and special forces, called guerrillas in this game, as with the Viet Cong. You also thus have the 2nd strongest military in the game, distantly after the U.S. The NVA gets a defensive bonus in mountain provinces, and if you have 3 red cubes in an area, you can sometimes bombard an area next door with artillery to safely remove a piece. Your specs can ambush pieces like the VC too. Your bases even have stealth capability, although that isn't easy to install. The NVA scores victory points by putting bases anywhere on the board, even Saigon if they can finagle it, and by controlling provinces, something their Viet Cong teammates can't do. In fact, to control a province, the NVA pieces have to outnumber all other colors together in an area, including the blue VC. The NVA starts with only 4 victory points, and while they only need 19 or more to trigger a potential win, this shows how hard it is for the NVA to score. Fortunately, the NVA is the only faction in the game to have an almost invulnerable province on the map, helpfully called North Vietnam. Team South forces cannot enter it, although it can be the target of events. Therefore, the NVA could theoretically lose control of it by moving out all of his pieces, or even by the VC moving in more total pieces. Also, fortunately, the NVA, like their teammates the VC, can never lose forces out of play. Any lost forces go straight back to being available, ready to put on the map. The NVA starts off as the second poorest faction with only 10 resources to do operations with. But like the VC, your operational costs are cheap, only 1 cash per target in an action, so you start out being able to do more than Arvin. Which is good because you also start out with the second least presence on the board. The NVA earns resources by putting bases in Laos and Cambodia, not in North Vietnam nor in South Vietnam. Bases can still be put in those areas, in fact you start off with 1 in North Vietnam, and they're useful there, but they don't generate cash there. You also earn resources by keeping the Ho Chi Minh Trail up and running, which is also where bases have to be put to earn income. The concept here is that the NVA has to keep the trail running in order to operate in South Vietnam. You're a nation state, you have the resources, you just can't get them anywhere useful for the war without the trail. The trail in this game also represents various naval supply operations abstractly. The NVA has only 5 permanent and temporary bonuses in the game, but that's the second most after the US. This also means you only have 5 hurtful penalties in the game. Primarily to score, the NVA uses rally operations to place bases, and just about anything else to increase troops in South Nam provinces and cities in order to take control. Unfortunately, rally takes time because it needs NVA guerrillas to turn into bases, and requires that there be no support for the Saigon regime in the areas to start with. The NVA helps their VC teammate by inflicting terror on populations, which moves opinion toward neutral, which can give the VC more of an edge in agitating the populace against Saigon once someone removes that terror marker. On the other hand, you can use your special infiltrate ability to turn VC forces, including bases and including tunneled bases, into NVA forces. The NVA has the ability to beat the US in any tie, but loses ties to everyone else. Like all 4 factions, the NVA player gets your own special event card that only you can throw. What does it mean to play the VC? The VC forces are the weakest in the game, not only because you're the only faction with no divisions, but also because you only have 39 total forces, 30 specs, which the game calls guerrillas like the NVA specs, and 9 bases. However, all your forces have stealth capability, including your bases, and your specs can be highly destructive when not engaged in a conventional fight. The VCs start with 27 victory points and need at least 36 to trigger a potential win. You score by putting bases on the board, anywhere, although anywhere without South Nam populations will greatly cripple your base's effectiveness, and by convincing South Nam provinces to oppose Saigon. The VC, like your teammates the NVA, can never lose forces out of play. Any lost forces go straight back to being available. The VC starts off as the poorest faction with only 5 resources to do operations with, but they can grow to have a higher income than Arvin, partly by hurting the Arvin economy. That takes work, but the VC player has plenty of time in the long game. The VC can't control a province or city. They can only deny control to other players. But they start out well lodged into a lot of South Vietnam, and wherever they are unopposed, which is several provinces, they start with active opposition against Saigon, which generates them double victory points based on the province population. Unfortunately, the areas they do start with another player, that player is the US, the strongest military in the game. The VC has nearly the fewest permanent and temporary bonuses in the game, only 3. But this also means they only have 3 hurtful penalties in the game. Primarily to score, the VC uses terror operations and an agitate special operation during coups to increase opposition for the Saigon regime, and also rally operations to build bases. But rally takes time because it needs VC guerrillas to turn into bases and requires no support in the areas to start with. This also means the VC player will be looking to capitalize on these kinds of shaded card events. Fortunately, unlike the NVA, the VC terror operation does move an area's opinion against Saigon, not only to neutral. The VC helps their NVA teammate by rallying up and maneuvering specs into area to deny coin control, and then to move them out of the way when the NVA arrives. Sometimes this involves using special events and abilities to whack US and ARVN troops without fighting. The VC specs can attack, but aren't strong against Team South, and anyone attacking the US will always lose at least one piece for every US piece they succeed in removing. The Viet Cong mess up their ally, on the other hand, by sending specs and building bases into areas that the NVA wants to control. The VC earns resources by the tax special ability, but because this is a special ability, the VC doesn't get to use it often. They also earn resources from how many bases they've got on the map during scoring rounds, and unlike the NVA, these bases can be anywhere to generate the income. The VC are the only faction not required to redeploy during the scoring rounds. The VC player, most importantly, wins every tie. Like all four factions, the VC player gets a special event card that only you can throw. Lastly, what does it mean to play ARVN, also known in the game as GVN, the Government of Vietnam? Apparently, I'll be playing ARVN this time. ARVN forces, being one of the two most local governments, are technically tied with NVA as the most numerous, but I have the fewest available bases in the game, only 3, and 2 of those start out of play entirely, and the fewest available special forces, 6 like the US, but 3 of those also start out of play entirely. ARVN has the most divisions, the little cubes, at 60, but half of those are only large paramilitary police groups, useful for a lot of area control activities in the game, but not really useful for fighting. The ARVN police divisions can fight, but use the worst results in the game. While ARVN regular divisions are technically a match for the NVA in strength, they lack the NVA's ability to fight well in mountain provinces. Beyond those problems, a full 10 divisions of my regular infantry start the game completely out of play, not available for deployment. And ARVN is the only faction which sends all losses immediately out of play. Due to the nature of the conflict, though, ARVN starts with by far the most forces on the board, mostly in the cities. ARVN scores victory points by controlling South Nam populations, and I don't really care how that's done. It can be established by US forces just as well. So if any number of US and or ARVN forces outnumber any combination of Team North forces in such an area, that area gets a coin control marker. In this respect, the ARVN is competing against the NVA, except with the advantage that Team South can cooperate in achieving this, while the Viet Cong can only help deny all control, not help provide NVA control. The other way ARVN scores victory points is by scoring patronage. I start with 15 patron points, but in a way, patron points are poison because patronage basically counts as political corruption. So when the ARVN does things to increase patronage, I tend to also reduce support and or aid. The ruthless regime struggling for control in South Vietnam don't really care whether a population centers support them, so long as ARVN has control of them. These are the US allies, ladies and gentlemen. Speaking of aid, ARVN is the richest team in the game that tracks its budget. The US is so rich that they don't have to track expenses, and so in effect their forces operate for free. But there's a catch. Only 15 points of resources at most can come from South Vietnam's own capabilities. ARVN starts the game with this maximum econ, which is why there's an econ chip on the 15-point mark of the track going around the board. These points come directly from controlling the 15 most important lines of communication on the board, almost all of which are worth 1 point, except for the branch between Con Tho and Saigon, which also has a double-lane highway and so grants 2 points. There is no practical difference between loc type otherwise, whether river or road, and some locs are worth 0 points, like the southernmost road in the game between Con Tho and the coastal city of Bac Lu. Economic power also limits how much of ARVN's resources the US can spend ordering ARVN forces around. The US player cannot spend ARVN's money any lower than wherever the econ chip currently sits. That isn't actually theft, though, because this represents the US spending money they gave to ARVN in the first place through aid. Wait, I still haven't talked about aid yet, have I? Speaking of aid, ARVN gets its other income in the game from United States support, which is tracked as aid. This starts out as 15, along with econ and patronage. Aid, a little roughly speaking, reflects money that either the ARVN or the US can spend on operations that use ARVN forces. It also represents money that I've been promised by the United States, which I will get during coup turns. But there's a catch. However corrupt the U.S. government is and was by U.S. moral standards, we're significantly less corrupt and less tolerant of it than in many other countries, and South Vietnam is essentially a military junta. Consequently, the U.S. does want South Vietnam to clean up its act and be good to its people. So game mechanics will often involve increasing aid if patronage is reduced. But Arvin needs patronage points to win. Therefore, to win, Arvin actually has to reduce aid from the U.S., reducing Arvin's ability to fight against NVA and VC insurgency. Arvin doesn't start out with active support anywhere, but they do start with a lot of coin control, and the victory points those provide, and with no trivial amount of passive support for the regime. While support for the regime doesn't help them directly in score, and technically the Arvin doesn't need it at all in order to win, it does help in other ways. Arvin has the fewest permanent and temporary bonuses in the game, only 2. But this also means they only have 2 hurtful penalties in the game. Primarily to score, Arvin uses govern operations and some related special events to increase patronage, and otherwise a bunch of troop movements to take and secure coin control. I can help my U.S. ally and indirectly help myself by pacification operations to increase support. In an indirect way, this can help earn patronage too by providing enough support to trade back for patronage points, which also reduces victory points for the U.S. It also reduces aid from the U.S., giving me more difficulty in affording operations. Arvin will win any tie as long as the other player isn't the Viet Cong. There's a special box on the game board called RVN Leader, Republic of Vietnam. He starts as Duong Van Minh and provides the Arvin player with a special ongoing bonus ability. Initially, each Arvin train operation increases aid by 5 points. Out of the 6 coups in the game, 4 feature new governments taking over the regime, and when that happens, the new coup cards go here after their scoring turns instead of being discarded. When that happens, the Arvin player gets new ongoing abilities or disabilities, typically ones that reflect tension with the U.S. 2 of the coups will fail, and this doesn't change the current regime. The fail card gets slid under the active regime card. Scoring still happens, though, if it's the first of 2 coups in a row. Like all 4 factions, the Arvin player gets a special event card that only I can throw. And with that, I've reached the end of my shorter introduction to the game. Was it only 5 minutes long? Not at all of doom. Doom, 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 doom. Amen, 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 amen.